Hi everyone, and welcome to the last week of lab. I am super sad by this. I was hoping for a better outcome of seeing you guys before the end of the term. Apparently that's not going to happen, obviously. But I hope you're all safe and doing well. So I am doing this last video for the PowerPoint that I am showing you for evolution. I'm very also sad because these last two units are my favorite. I love genetics. I probably would have been a geneticist if I would have had a genetics class earlier in my master's program. But I thought that this might be easy for you if I were to explain the PowerPoint so you didn't have to guess. And also Hardy Weinberg pieces that you're doing this week are a little tricky. Just remember that you can use those equations interchangeably. They don't have to be used all at the same time. You can use one to get to the other. Very, very tricky. But if you need help, please email me. We can do a Zoom meeting so that you can get the help that you need on how to do those. They're pretty tricky, but once you get them, they're actually very fun. A couple reminders. This week lasts until Saturday at midnight. Make sure you get everything in. Please, on the post lab, make sure that you don't do number 7. It was actually accidentally left on there. It's asking you to do a requirement for the lab, which you don't have access to, so you can skip that question. You will not be penalized for that. The lab lasts from Monday today, the 20th, all the way to the 25th. And then shortly after that, I will be wrapping up your grades and letting you know when I'm done so you can look at it. I pretty much have tried to get everything in there as that I have. If you see something that might be missing or that you feel that you turned in, remember that the only way that I go by things is whether or not they're in Canvas. So if it's not showing up in Canvas, then it's a 0. So double check your submissions and then email me if you have issues. All right, let's get to it. So this last lab is evolution. Again, you cannot talk about evolution without talking about Darwin. So we're gonna go right to the PowerPoint. It's not a very long one, it's super short. So let's just get to it. So this lab is on evolution. And so we start with Darwin himself. So evolution, we'll talk about that is right up here in the corner, the definition for that and what that looks like. So Charles Darwin, father of evolution, all of his work, along with Wallace, who was his partner in the book that he wrote, Origin of the Species, he was the main person, the guy that started all of it. He actually had a lot of information way before his book was published. He was actually holding it because at the time it was kind of controversial. And the only reason he published it at the point that he did is because Wallace had gone on an adventure himself and had used Charles as a back knowledge person and was sending him stuff on his voyage. And Charles Darwin realized that if he didn't publish, Wallace was going to publish first. And Wallace decided that he was going to work with Darwin. So in the event of scientists that never happened, because usually scientists pitted against each other, they worked together, and Charles Darwin published Origin of the Species, and then Wallace published his own works based on each other's research. So Darwin's theory of evolution is that evolution or change over time is the process in which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. We have a lot of records that prove that that's true, and we're going to talk about that at the end. But that was his biggest thing. He went to the Galapagos Islands, which, if you're a biologist, is like the mecca of biology. If that's my bucket list piece. But he went there as a research piece, and he was fascinated because there were so many different tortoises and marine iguanas in the Galapagos, and he was trying to figure out why there was so much variation between the islands. And so using the shape of the tortoise's shell, he could tell you which island each particular tortoise inhabited. And so then he just started putting other things together along with that and came up with his theory. So a lot animals that he also looked at other than that was the finches. The birds, their differences on each island, bigger beaks, smaller beaks, that kind of thing, and then the marine iguanas. So all of this was the capstone of his research, and that's what led his research to evolution. So when he was on his way home, he not only went to the Galapagos Islands, but other places. And then his hypothesis was developed during that research piece that separate species have arose from an original ancestor. And he thought that was true for most of the animals, or all of the animals that he studied on the Galapagos Islands and in other areas. So he came up with his theory that natural variation itself was the differences between individuals of a species. So when he was looking at finches, when he was looking at the tortoises, they were all the same type of species, tortoise versus finch, but they had variations among them. And so he chalked that up to natural variation. And then over time, he believed that natural selection resulted in the change of the inherited traits based on the population or the characteristics of the population, and increase the physical fitness or species fitness to that environment. So for each different island, depending on what that bird needed or what that tortoise needed, is how that species evolved. So 2 pieces to natural selection, or evolution by natural selection, is the struggle for existence. So members of each species have to compete for food, shelter, and other things in order to survive. So whoever can compete the best will survive. And then survival of the fittest, where some individuals are actually better suited for the environment. So for example, we have the peppered moth, which is an example of natural selection. So these were moths that were, during the Industrial Revolution, they lived in the eastern part of the United States and the northeastern part. Most of the moths that they saw were white. And the reason that they did was because the trees around that area were more white. And so when they were looking at moths, there were more white moths than there were black moths, these black moths on the bottom. And so as the Industrial Revolution occurred, those white trees began to turn black due to the elements that are put into the air. And so they started to see a trend where the white moths no longer survived as well. And then the better suited black moths were the ones that they saw most of. So that selected allele for that pale color poorly camouflaged those little guys. And so the predators were easily picking them off. The black moths during that time, when the Industrial Revolution occurred and the trees turned black, now are hidden better, and so their species or their particular allele for that dark color was more determined inside of that particular species. And so they saw more of those dark moths that would survive. Now, it didn't mean that it wiped out white moths. It just means that there weren't as many. So that's a perfect example of natural selection for a species where one is better suited to the environment. Descent is another piece of what Darwin came up with. So descent with modification means that each living organism has descended with change from other species. So he's looking at the finches, when he's looking at the tortoises, he could tell that they existed from one species, and over time, based on where they were, their makeup changed. And so common descent means that we derive from one ancestor or a common ancestor. And so for those finches and for the tortoise, all of them derived in his eyes from a common ancestor, and then they branched out from there. And then the last thing is the evidence that we have that this occurs. So we have fossil records, and we have the geographic distribution of living things even now on the planet. And then of course, homologous body structures, because if you look at the way that our arms are built, if you look at things like a whale's fin, the top fin on the top part of its body, it has the same bones that we do. They're just either bigger or in modification to its size. So there are homologous body structures that we have in common with other species. And then of course, if you look at similarities in early development, you'll see that the embryos of humans actually look very similar to other animals, such as birds. All right, so hope that was very helpful. There's a lot more into this lab that I can do in a very short PowerPoint presentation. However, if you need help with this, I'm more than happy to help you out. So I hope you all are doing well, and that you're staying safe and healthy. Again, if you need my help, please let me know. But it has been an honor and a privilege to work with you through this unprecedented time of online labs. I wish that our time would not have been cut short. It has been fun, and I hope that in the future, if you're going to take human physiology lab, you might look for me. So with that being said, have a great week.